Welcome to Principles of Ecology. Today, we are going to explore two of the most fundamental concepts in community ecology: species richness and species dominance. If you have ever walked through a forest and wondered why some areas feel teeming with diverse life, while others seem completely taken over by just one type of plant, you are already thinking like an ecologist. Understanding these two concepts is absolutely critical because they give us the mathematical and conceptual tools to measure the health, stability, and resilience of any ecosystem on Earth. Let us dive in and learn how to read the story of nature. To understand our first topic, let us imagine you are walking into a giant candy store. You want to know how exciting the selection is. If the store has thousands of candies, but they are only chocolate bars, lollipops, and gummy bears, you might feel a bit disappointed. The sheer number of candies does not make up for the lack of variety. However, if that same store sells 50 completely different types of candy, the experience becomes much more thrilling. In ecology, we look at nature in the exact same way. We are not just interested in how many total organisms are present, but rather how many completely different types of organisms share that space. Now that we have our candy store analogy in mind, let us formally define what this means in biology. Species richness is defined as the absolute number of different species represented in an ecological community. It is the simplest and most fundamental measure of biodiversity. The key rule here is that species richness does not take into account how many individuals of each species are present. It simply asks, is this species present or absent? For example, if a forest contains exactly one single oak tree and 1 million pine trees, the oak and the pine each count exactly as one toward the total species richness. It is a straightforward tally of unique characters in our ecological story. You might be wondering, why do ecologists care so much about simply counting species? The answer is that species richness acts as a primary indicator of ecosystem health and stability. Ecosystems with higher species richness are generally much more resilient to environmental changes, diseases, and natural disasters. Think of it like an insurance policy for nature. If a disease wipes out one specific plant species in a highly rich forest, there are many other plant species left to provide food and shelter for the animals. Conversely, in a habitat with very low species richness, the loss of just one species could cause the entire food web to collapse. This is exactly why conservationists use richness to identify and protect critical habitats. While simply counting species gives us a basic number, we run into a problem when we want to compare a small meadow to a massive forest. To do this fairly, we use mathematical formulas like Margalef's richness index. Conceptually, this formula adjusts the raw species count based on the total number of individuals present. Let us look at the symbols. D represents the standardized index score we are trying to find. S stands for the total number of different species. N represents the total number of individual organisms counted across all species. Finally, we use the natural logarithm, or ln, to scale down very large population numbers so they do not skew our results. If the number of species S increases while the total population, N, stays the same, our richness index D will increase, indicating a more diverse community. Now that we have our formula, let us see it in action with a concrete example. Suppose you are an ecologist studying a small wildflower meadow. You count a total of 150 individual flowers, which is our N. Among these, you identify 12 completely different species, which is our S. We want to calculate the richness index. First, we substitute our known values into the formula, giving us 12 minus 1 over the natural log of 150. We simplify the numerator to 11. Next, using a calculator, we find the natural logarithm of 150 is approximately 5.01. Finally, dividing 11 by 5.01 gives us our final answer of 2.19. This standardized score allows us to fairly compare this meadow's richness to any other habitat, regardless of size. Before we move on to our next major topic, let us visualize what we just calculated. On the screen, you are looking at a comparison between two different forest plots. Notice that both plots contain exactly 20 trees in total. However, the plot on the left represents low species richness. Every single tree is a pine tree. Its species count is just 1. The plot on the right represents high species richness. Even though it also has only 20 trees, it contains pines, oaks, maples, birches, and willows. Its species count is 5. This diagram perfectly illustrates that richness is not about the total volume of life, but the variety of life. The forest on the right would have a much higher Margalef's index and would be far more resilient to a disease that only targets pine trees. Now that we understand species richness, we must ask another critical question about our ecosystem. Imagine attending a town hall meeting with 100 people in the room. If one person holds the microphone and talks for 99 minutes, while everyone else shares the remaining 1 minute, that single person is completely dominating the conversation. The room has many people, so the richness is high, but the influence is entirely lopsided. In ecology, we see the exact same phenomenon in nature, which we call species dominance. Even if a forest has many different species of trees, if one specific type makes up 95% of the forest, that tree is the dominant species. It controls the sunlight, the water, and the overall character of the environment. Building on that analogy, let us formally define species dominance. Dominance is an ecological concept that describes the degree to which one or a few species make up the majority of the individuals, biomass, or space in a given community. Why species richness just asks how many types are here, dominance asks, are the individuals evenly distributed among those types, or does one type take over? A highly dominant community is one where a single species is overwhelmingly abundant, leaving all other species as rare minorities struggling for resources. Conversely, a community with low dominance has its individuals spread out relatively evenly among all the different species present, creating a much more balanced and equitable environment. Understanding dominance is absolutely crucial for ecologists because high dominance usually acts as a warning sign. It frequently points to an ecosystem under stress or an environment with extreme conditions. For example, imagine a highly polluted river. The sensitive fish species will quickly die off. This lack of competition allows one single pollution-tolerant species to multiply rapidly and completely dominate the ecosystem. When one species dominates like this, it monopolizes critical resources like food, water, and physical space, making it very difficult for any other species to recover or thrive. Therefore, ecologists carefully measure dominance to assess the balance and overall health of a community, knowing that balanced communities are generally much more stable. To measure exactly how dominant the most common species are, ecologists rely on a famous formula called Simpson's Dominance Index. Conceptually, This index calculates the probability that any two individuals randomly selected from the community will belong to the exact same species. Let us break down the symbols. D represents Simpson's dominance index, which always results in a score between 0 and 1. The Greek letter sigma tells us we need to add up our calculations for every single species in the community. The variable n sub I represents the population count of one specific species, while n is the total population of all species combined. By dividing n sub I by n, we find the proportion of the community that belongs to that species. We square that proportion and sum them all up. A final value close to 1 means the community is highly dominated by a single species. Let us apply this formula to a real-world scenario. Imagine an ecologist surveys a forest patch and counts exactly 100 trees. This is our N. The survey reveals 90 pine trees, 6 oak trees, and 4 maple trees. We want to calculate Simpson's dominance index. First, we set up our equation by dividing each specific tree count by the total population of 100. Next, we convert these fractions into decimals, giving us 0.90 for pine, 0.06 for oak, and 0.04 for maple. According to the formula, we now square each of these decimal values. Squaring is a mathematical trick that heavily weights the most abundant species. Notice how the pine's squared value of 0.81 vastly overwhelms the others. Finally, we add these squared numbers together. Our final answer is 0.8152. Because this is very close to 1, it proves mathematically that the pine trees are completely dominating this forest. To truly grasp what that calculation means, let us look at this data visually. On your screen is a bar chart representing the exact forest we just analyzed. The vertical axis shows the number of individuals, and the horizontal axis lists our 3 tree species. Look at the massive disparity here. The bar for the pine trees shoots all the way up to 90, completely dwarfing the tiny bars for the oak and maple trees. This visual perfectly captures the essence of species dominance. Even though there are 3 different characters in this ecological play, one character is hogging all the stage time. This visual imbalance is exactly what a Simpson's index of 0.8152 looks like in the real world, indicating an ecosystem that may be vulnerable to environmental shocks. We have covered a lot of ground today, so let us review our key takeaways. First, we learned that species richness is simply the count of how many different species live in a community, acting as the basic building block of biodiversity. We used Margolyeff's index to standardize this count, allowing us to compare different habitats fairly. Second, we explored species dominance, which tells us if a community is controlled by just one overwhelmingly common species. We used Simpson's index to calculate this, discovering that high dominance almost always indicates an unbalanced ecosystem vulnerable to stress. By mastering both richness and dominance, you now have the fundamental tools ecologists use to monitor and protect the health of our natural world. Great job, and keep exploring.